The autumn wind carried the smell of pine and wood smoke down from the high peaks of the Colorado Rockies as Howard Swift guided his wagon along the rutted mountain road. It was October 1907, and the first serious cold snap of the season had already dusted the higher elevations with snow. Howard pulled his collar tighter against the chill, his weathered hands steady on the reins as his team of draft horses navigated the treacherous descent toward Timber Ridge. He'd made this journey twice a year for the past 15 years, bringing his modest beef cattle to market in the valley town below. But this year felt different. This year Howard was traveling alone. 6 months earlier, his younger brother Daniel had left the mountain ranch they'd built together, heading east to Denver with promises of steady work and a regular wage. Howard couldn't blame him. The Swift Ranch barely produced enough to keep 2 men fed through the winter, let alone turn a profit. At 42 years old, Howard faced the very real possibility that he'd spend the rest of his life scraping by in isolation, watching the seasons turn from his cabin window while the world moved on without him. The town of Timber Ridge sat in a valley where 3 mountain streams converged, creating a natural hub for the scattered ranchers and miners who worked the surrounding peaks. As Howard's wagon rolled down Main Street, he noted the new electric lights strung between the buildings, a stark reminder of how quickly things were changing, even in these remote places. He completed his business at the stockyard by mid-afternoon, securing a fair price for his cattle, but not the windfall he'd hoped for. With a few hours of daylight remaining and $20 in his pocket, Howard did what he always did when faced with disappointment. He walked. His boots carried him past the mercantile, the assay office, and the small hotel where miners fresh from their claims drank away their earnings. He was nearly at the edge of town when he heard the commotion coming from behind the livery stable. A crowd had gathered in the dusty lot, forming a loose circle around something Howard couldn't quite see. He recognized most of the faces, local ranchers, a few townsmen, old Albert Gunderson who ran the livery. They were all watching something in the center of the ring with expressions that ranged from pity to disgust. "Should just put her down," someone muttered. "Kindest thing, really." "Shame," another voice added. "She was a beauty before the accident." Howard pushed through the crowd, his tall frame giving him a view over the shorter men in front. What he saw made his breath catch. In the center of the circle stood a Palomino mare, her golden coat dulled by dust and neglect. She held her head at an odd angle, moving it slowly from side to side in a repetitive motion that spoke of confusion and fear. Her eyes, those once bright windows to a horse's soul, were clouded over with the milky white of complete blindness. "That's Willow," Albert Gunderson said, noticing Howard's arrival. "Belonged to the Caldwell outfit up north. Got tangled in wire fencing during a storm this spring. Tore up her face something awful. By the time they found her, infection had already taken her sight." The mare stumbled slightly, and the crowd shifted backward. She was thin, too thin, her ribs visible beneath her matted coat. Fresh cuts marked her legs where she'd obviously collided with obstacles she couldn't see. "Been trying to find someone to take her for 3 weeks now," Albert continued, shaking his head. "Caldwells can't afford to keep a horse that can't work, and nobody wants a blind mare. She's dangerous to herself and everyone around her. Keeps running into things, panics at every sound. This morning she knocked over 6 feed buckets and nearly trampled young Billy when he tried to put a halter on her." "So what happens now?" Howard asked, though he already knew the answer. Albert pulled a rifle from where it leaned against the stable wall. "Told the Caldwells I'd handle it. Can't in good conscience sell her or give her away. She'd just suffer somewhere else. This is mercy." The crowd began to disperse, men turning away to avoid witnessing what came next. But Howard stood frozen, watching as the blind mare lifted her head, nostrils flaring as she tried to make sense of a world she could no longer see. Something in that gesture, that desperate attempt to understand her surroundings, struck Howard with unexpected force. He saw himself in that horse, blind in his own way, stumbling through life, colliding with obstacles, unable to find his way forward. "How much?" The words left Howard's mouth before his brain could catch up. Albert lowered the rifle, staring at Howard as if he'd lost his mind. "How much for what?" "For the mare. How much do the Caldwells want for her?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the remaining onlookers. Albert set the rifle down completely, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Now, Howard, I know you're a decent man, but you can't seriously be considering." "How much?" Howard repeated, his jaw set. "They said they'd take $5 just to cover the feed she's wasted these past months," Albert said slowly. "But Howard, listen to me. This horse is finished. She can't be ridden, can't pull a wagon, can't even be led safely. She'll hurt herself, hurt you, or both. This isn't like buying a lame horse you might nurse back to health. She's blind, permanently. That's not something that heals." Howard pulled out his billfold, counting out 5 $1 bills. His entire profit from the cattle sale was $20. He was now giving up a quarter of it for a horse everyone said was worthless. "I'll need a lead rope," he said quietly. Albert stood motionless for a long moment, then sighed the sigh of a man who'd seen too many fools part with their money in his lifetime. He fetched a worn lead rope from the stable, handing it to Howard along with a whispered warning. "If you change your mind in the next hour, bring her back. I'll return your money and handle this properly. No shame in it." Howard approached the blind mare slowly, speaking in a low, steady voice. "Easy now, girl, easy." Willow's head swung toward the sound, her clouded eyes unseeing, but her ears pricked forward with desperate attention. When Howard's hand touched her neck, she flinched violently, stumbling sideways and nearly falling. The few remaining spectators shook their heads and walked away, their judgment clear. Howard Swift had just wasted $5 on a horse that would be dead within a month. The journey back up the mountain was unlike any Howard had ever experienced. What should have taken 3 hours stretched into 6. Willow balked at every unfamiliar sound, spooked at shadows she couldn't see, and repeatedly tried to turn back toward the only place she knew, even if that place was the town where she'd been scheduled for death. Howard learned quickly that force was useless. Every time he tried to pull her forward, she planted her feet and refused to move, her whole body trembling with fear. The only thing that worked was patience, waiting her out, speaking softly, letting her process each new sensation before asking her to take another step. By the time they reached the Swift ranch, full dark had fallen. Howard's arms ached from the constant tension on the lead rope, and his throat was raw from hours of talking to a horse that couldn't see his face or read his body language. All he had was his voice, and he'd used it like a lifeline, narrating every bump in the road, every turn in the path, every sound that might startle her. The ranch itself was modest, a small cabin, a sturdy barn, a handful of corrals, and several hundred acres of high mountain pasture where Howard's remaining cattle grazed during the summer months. In the moonlight, it looked even more isolated than usual, a tiny outpost of human ambition clinging to an indifferent mountainside. Howard led Willow into the barn, guiding her carefully into a box stall he'd hastily cleared of equipment. She stood in the center of the space, head raised, sides heaving, utterly exhausted but too frightened to rest. "I know," Howard said softly, filling a bucket with clean water and placing it where she might find it. "I know you're scared. But you're safe now. I promise you that." He spread fresh hay in the corner, checked the stall door twice to make sure it was secure, and finally trudged to his cabin. Inside, he lit a lamp and sank into his chair, suddenly aware of how thoroughly exhausted he was. What had he done? $5 he couldn't afford, for a horse he couldn't use, that every expert had said was beyond help. Daniel would have called him a fool. And he'd probably have been right, but as Howard sat in the flickering lamplight, listening to the wind howl around his cabin, he thought about that moment in town when he'd seen Willow standing in that circle of judgment. He thought about how the crowd had looked at her, as a problem to be disposed of, a burden to be eliminated, a creature whose value had expired. He'd spent his entire life feeling like the world looked at him the same way, the neighbors who'd moved away to find better opportunities, the woman he'd courted who'd chosen a shopkeeper over a struggling mountain rancher, his own brother, leaving because he couldn't see a future here. Maybe saving Willow wasn't about the horse at all. Maybe it was about proving that something written off as worthless could still have value, that the end of one kind of life didn't mean the end of all possibility. Or maybe he was just a fool with $5 fewer and one more mouth to feed through the winter. Only time would tell. The first weeks were brutal. Willow refused to eat for the first 3 days, standing in her stall like a statue, trembling at every sound. Howard spent hours in the barn, sitting quietly in the corner of her stall, just letting her hear his breathing, his occasional movements, the rhythm of his presence. On the fourth day, he woke before dawn to find she'd finally touched the hay. It wasn't much, just a few mouthfuls, but it was something. Progress came in similarly small increments. By the end of the first week, Willow would tolerate his presence near her head, though she still flinched when he touched her. By the end of the second week, she'd learned the dimensions of her stall and stopped colliding with the walls quite so often. But the real challenge was everything beyond that stall. Howard needed to work his ranch, and he couldn't do it while spending all day in the barn. He tried leaving Willow alone and returned to find her had kicked a hole in the stall door in her panic. He tried putting her in a corral, and she ran headlong into the fence repeatedly, tearing new cuts in her already scarred face. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Howard told her one evening, examining a fresh wound on her shoulder. She stood rigid under his touch, every muscle tense with barely controlled fear. "I'm trying to help you, but you've got to meet me halfway." The problem, Howard realized, was that Willow had no framework for understanding her blindness. Before the accident, she'd been a working ranch horse, trusted and capable. She'd navigated the world through sight, and now that sight was gone, she had no alternative way of processing her environment. Every sound was a potential threat. Every touch could be an attack. Without vision to confirm what her other senses told her, she lived in a constant state of terror. That realization changed Howard's approach. He stopped trying to make Willow adapt to the world as it was, and instead began trying to create a world she could understand. He started by establishing absolute consistency. Every morning at the same time he entered the barn speaking the same greeting, "Good morning, Willow." He always approached her stall from the same direction. He always entered through the same spot in the door. He always touched her in the same place first, the left side of her neck, just above her shoulder. He mapped out her stall with his hands, making sure there were no unexpected obstacles. He filled her water bucket at the same time every day, letting it splash loudly so she'd know it was being filled. He spread her hay in the exact same corner every evening. For 3 weeks he never deviated from this routine, not once. Slowly, incrementally, Willow began to relax. She learned to recognize his footsteps approaching the barn. She'd turn her head toward the door before he opened it, ears pricked forward, waiting for his voice. When he entered her stall, her muscles didn't tighten quite so dramatically. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that might become trust, given enough time. November brought the first serious snow. Howard woke one morning to find 6 inches of white powder blanketing the ranch, with more falling steadily from a gray sky. He went through his morning routine, feeding his cattle, checking his equipment, chopping wood for the stove, but his mind kept drifting to the barn. How would Willow react to the snow? Would the changed acoustics of the world terrify her? Would the cold air smell different enough to panic her? When he finally made it to the barn, he found her standing in her stall, head raised, nostrils flaring as she processed the transformed world outside. She wasn't panicking, but she wasn't calm either. "It's just snow, girl," Howard said, approaching with his usual consistency. "Nothing to fear." On impulse, he opened her stall door and clipped a lead rope to her halter. He had no particular plan, but something told him she needed to experience this change rather than simply hear it from inside her stall. He led her slowly to the barn door, narrating every step. When they reached the threshold, Willow stopped, her front hooves at the edge of the new white world. She stretched her neck forward, nostrils working overtime. Howard scooped up a handful of snow and held it near her muzzle. She snorted, jerking her head back, then cautiously extended her nose to investigate. Her warm breath melted the snow in Howard's palm, and she licked at the resulting water with clear surprise. "It's just frozen water," Howard explained, "cold, but harmless." He led her forward one step. Her hoof sank into the soft snow, and she pulled back sharply, but Howard held steady, speaking calmly. After a moment, she reached forward with the same hoof, testing the strange surface more carefully. They stood like that for 20 minutes, Willow exploring the snow one careful step at a time, Howard narrating and encouraging, both of them learning a new way of experiencing the world together. It was a small moment, unremarkable in the grand scheme of things. But later, Howard would mark it as the first time Willow chose to move forward into something unknown, rather than retreat into something familiar. It was the first time she showed courage instead of just fear. Winter settled over the high country like a heavy blanket. The temperature dropped, the snow deepened, and Howard's world shrank to the space between his cabin and his barn. This was the season he'd always dreaded most, the long, dark months of isolation, with nothing but his own thoughts for company. But this year was different. This year, he had Willow. Every morning and evening, he made the trek to the barn, regardless of weather. Blizzards, bitter cold, howling wind. None of it mattered. Willow was depending on him, and he wouldn't let her down. He talked to her constantly, narrating his day, his thoughts, even reading aloud from the few books he owned. It probably seemed ridiculous, a grown man reading Mark Twain to a blind horse. But Willow seemed to respond to the sound of his voice, her ears tracking his movements around the stall. As the weeks passed, something remarkable began to happen. Willow started to anticipate Howard's movements. When he entered her stall and moved toward the feed bucket, she'd move her head toward where she knew he'd be. When he walked behind her, she'd shift her weight but no longer flinch. She was building a mental map of her small world, learning to navigate by sound and memory rather than sight. Howard began documenting these changes in a journal he kept by lamplight each evening. He'd never been much of a writer, but he felt compelled to record what he was witnessing. November 15th. Willow nickered when I approached the barn this morning before I'd even opened the door. She recognized my footsteps in the snow. November 23rd. She's begun turning her head to follow sounds. Birds in the rafters, mice in the hay. She's learning to interpret her world through her ears. The observations filled page after page, a chronicle of small victories that together formed something extraordinary. Howard found himself looking forward to these evening writing sessions, analyzing what had worked during the day and planning new approaches for tomorrow. It gave structure to his solitary existence, purpose to his isolation. Encouraged by this progress, Howard began expanding her world gradually. He led her around the barn interior, teaching her the locations of posts, doors, and equipment. He developed a vocabulary of commands, not the usual riding commands, but navigational ones. "Post ahead," he'd say, and then guide her slightly to the left or right. "Corner coming." And she'd feel the rope turn before they changed direction. "Door here," and she'd know to pick up her feet higher to clear the threshold. It was painstaking work, requiring more patience than Howard knew he possessed. But slowly, undeniably, Willow was learning. More than that, she was regaining something he'd thought was lost forever: confidence. One evening in late December, Howard unclipped her lead rope while she was standing in the barn's center aisle. Willow didn't move immediately, but after a moment, she took a careful step forward. Then another. She walked slowly but deliberately down the aisle, her shoulder nearly brushing the stall doors she knew were there, until she reached her own stall and stopped, waiting at the entrance. Howard felt tears prick his eyes. She'd navigated that space entirely on her own, using only her memory and her other senses. She'd found her way home. "Good girl," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You brilliant, brave girl." Christmas came and went, marked only by Howard giving Willow an extra portion of oats and a thorough brushing that she actually seemed to enjoy. As he worked the curry comb through her winter coat, he thought about how much she'd changed in the 3 months since he'd brought her home. Her weight was back, her coat gleaming, her cuts and scars healing. But the real change was deeper than physical. Willow no longer moved like a creature in constant fear. She was calm, purposeful, even curious about her environment. When Howard worked in the barn, she'd often rest her chin on the stall door, tracking his movements by sound, occasionally nickering to get his attention. But Howard knew what others would say, what Albert Gunderson and the other ranchers would say if they could see her now. She looked healthier, sure, but what was the point? She was still blind. She still couldn't be ridden or worked. She was still, by every practical measure, useless. The thought bothered Howard more than it should have. He'd saved Willow because it felt like the right thing to do, not because he expected anything in return. But part of him, the part that had spent his whole life trying to prove his worth, wanted desperately to show that she was more than just a well-fed pet. The opportunity came in January, during one of the worst cold snaps Howard had ever experienced. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero, and the wind screamed down from the peaks with a ferocity that made even short trips outside dangerous. Howard's cattle, scattered across his winter pasture, were in trouble. They'd grouped together in a ravine seeking shelter, but the ravine was rapidly filling with wind-driven snow. If he didn't get them moved to the protected meadow near the barn, they'd likely suffocate under the drifts. He'd need help. Under normal circumstances, he'd saddle his riding horse and use the animal's speed and agility to herd the cattle. But his riding horse had gone lame 2 weeks earlier and was in no condition for difficult work. That left only Willow. Howard stood in the barn, looking at the blind mare who'd learned to trust him, and asked himself a question he'd been avoiding for months. Was she really capable of more than he'd allowed her to attempt? He'd kept her safe, kept her world small and predictable. But safety and predictability had their own kind of blindness. Maybe Willow needed to be challenged. Maybe she needed the chance to discover what she was still capable of. Or maybe he was about to make a terrible mistake that would undo all the progress they'd made. Howard took a deep breath, made his decision, and pulled down his saddle from its rack. His hands trembled slightly as he carried it to Willow's stall. He'd never even considered riding her before. The risk seemed too great. One wrong move, one moment of panic, and they could both be seriously hurt. But his cattle were dying, and he had no other option. "Easy, girl," he murmured, approaching with the saddle blanket. "We're going to try something new today." Willow stood calmly as he placed the blanket on her back, then the saddle. She'd been saddled countless times before her accident, and the familiar weight seemed to trigger old memories. Her ears pricked forward with what almost seemed like anticipation. Howard tightened the cinch, checked it twice, then led her outside. For a long moment he stood beside her, one hand on the saddle horn, asking himself if he was really going to do this. Then he swung up into the saddle. Willow stood perfectly still, adjusting to his weight. Howard held his breath, waiting for panic, for bucking, for the frightened explosion he'd been warned about. But Willow simply turned her head slightly, as if checking that he was there, then waited for his signal. "All right, girl," Howard said softly, his voice shaking with emotion. "Let's go save those cattle." Riding Willow into the blizzard was like entering another world. The wind tore at Howard's coat and filled the air with stinging snow. He couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. For the first time in his life, he understood what Willow experienced every moment, that disorienting whiteness, that inability to see what lay ahead. But from the saddle, he could feel things he'd never felt while leading her. He could feel how she tested each step before fully committing her weight. He could feel how she adjusted her balance when the ground shifted beneath her. He could feel the intelligence in every movement, the careful deliberation of a creature who'd learned to navigate without sight. Straight ahead, he called over the wind, using the commands she'd learned. Nice and steady, Willow moved forward, her head lowered against the wind, but without the panic Howard had feared. She trusted him to guide her, just as he'd guided her through every challenge these past months. They moved slowly across the pasture, Howard using his legs and voice to direct her, navigating by memory and the occasional landmarks he could barely see. Twice, Willow stopped abruptly, refusing to move forward, and Howard realized she'd sensed something he'd missed, a hidden washout, a buried fence post. Her other senses, honed by months without sight, were actually more reliable in these conditions than his vision. "Good girl," he praised each time, trusting her instincts. "Turn right, then forward." When they reached the ravine, Howard could hear his cattle before he saw them. 10 head, huddled together, bawling in distress as snow piled up around them. They needed to be driven uphill and east, across a quarter-mile of open pasture to the sheltered meadow. From the saddle, Howard had the height and mobility he needed to properly work the herd. He guided Willow down into the ravine, positioning her at the back of the cattle. The cows, desperate and cold, were easier to move than he'd expected, but they wanted to scatter, to run in every direction at once. "We need to hold them together," Howard told Willow. "Left side, push them left." He applied pressure with his right leg, and Willow responded, moving laterally to turn the cattle. It was instinct for her, the old working knowledge coming back despite the blindness. She could hear the cattle, smell them, feel their movement through the vibrations in the ground. They worked like that for an hour, Howard directing from the saddle, Willow responding with the skill of a trained cow horse, the cattle slowly being herded through the blinding snow towards safety. When the herd started to drift too far left, Howard's leg pressure and voice commands brought Willow around to redirect them. When the cattle tried to scatter, Willow's calm, steady presence and quick responses kept them bunched together. There were difficult moments. Once a cow broke from the herd and Willow had to move fast to cut her off. Howard's heart was in his throat as the blind mare accelerated through snow she couldn't see, trusting completely in his guidance. But she moved with confidence, turned at his signal, and brought the wayward cow back to the group. Howard realized something profound as they worked. Willow wasn't just following his commands. She was thinking, problem-solving, adapting to challenges he couldn't even articulate. She was a partner, not just an obedient animal, and more than that, she was proving that blindness hadn't stolen her purpose. She was still a working horse, still capable, still valuable. When the last cow finally stumbled into the protected meadow, Howard stood beside Willow, both of them coated in snow and ice, both exhausted beyond measure. The blind mare had just done what everyone said was impossible. She'd worked, truly worked, despite her disability. "You did it," Howard said, his voice rough with cold and emotion. "You incredible girl, you actually did it." Willow turned her head toward his voice, and for a moment, Howard could swear she understood exactly what they'd accomplished together. Word of that day spread slowly through the mountain community. Howard mentioned it to the feed store owner during his next trip to town, and within a week, it had become local legend. Embellished, probably, but based on truth. The blind horse that worked a blizzard. The impossible mare that saved a herd. At first, Howard was uncomfortable with the attention. Ranchers he barely knew would stop him on the street to ask questions. Had he really herded cattle in that storm? Was the mare truly blind? How had he managed it? Some were genuinely curious, wanting to understand what had happened. Others were skeptical, certain the story had grown with retelling. Howard answered the questions simply and honestly, never embellishing, never claiming more than what had actually occurred. Yes, Willow was completely blind. Yes, they'd moved the cattle together. No, it hadn't been easy. Yes, it had taken months of patient work to reach that point. A few ranchers began stopping by the Swift place, making the long ride up the mountain just to see Willow for themselves. Howard would demonstrate how she'd learned to navigate, showing them the consistent patterns he'd established, explaining the vocabulary of commands he'd developed. Some visitors left impressed, others left unconvinced, suggesting Howard was deluding himself about the mare's capabilities. But there was one visitor whose opinion mattered more than the rest. In March, when the snow began to melt and the first hints of spring appeared in the valleys, Albert Gunderson made the long ride up to Howard's ranch. He claimed he was just checking in on old friends, but Howard knew better. Albert wanted to see Willow for himself. They stood at the corral fence, watching as Willow moved confidently around the enclosure Howard had carefully taught her to navigate. She knew every post, every water trough, every inch of ground. She grazed peacefully, occasionally lifting her head to locate Howard by sound. "I'll admit," Albert said slowly, "when you bought her, I gave her 2 weeks before you came to your senses. I figured by Christmas you'd have, well, I know what you figured," Howard said. "But here we are." Albert shook his head in wonder. "She looks healthy. Content even. And the story about the blizzard." "It's true," Howard interrupted. "Every word." Albert was quiet for a long moment, then said something Howard hadn't expected. "There's a family down valley, name of Douglas. They've got a son, maybe 12 years old. Took a bad fall last year and lost his sight. They're struggling to help him, don't know how to teach him to be independent. I was thinking—" He trailed off, but Howard understood. "You want them to see Willow," Howard finished. "Might give them some hope," Albert said. "Might give the boys some idea of what's possible." The Douglas family came on a bright Saturday in late April. The father led the boy, a thin child with bandages still covering his eyes, while the mother walked beside them, her face tight with the special pain of parents watching their child suffer. Howard had prepared carefully for this visit. He'd spent the morning grooming Willow until her coat shone like spun gold in the spring sunshine. He'd cleaned the barn, organized his tack room, and rehearsed what he might say. But when he saw the family climbing down from their wagon, all his preparations seemed inadequate. The boy moved hesitantly, one hand gripping his father's arm, the other extended slightly ahead of him. He was learning to navigate without sight, but the movements were new and uncertain. Howard recognized that uncertainty. He'd seen it in Willow during those first terrible weeks. Howard brought Willow out of the barn and stood with her in the spring sunshine. The boy's father explained who they were and why they'd come, his voice breaking slightly as he described the accident, the doctors who'd tried to save his son's vision, the grim prognosis they'd finally received. Howard understood. He walked over to the boy and took his hand gently. "Her name is Willow," he said. "Would you like to meet her?" He led the boy to Willow, placing his small hand on her neck. "She's blind, just like you. Lost her sight in an accident 9 months ago. Everyone said she'd never work again, that there was no point in trying to help her." The boy's fingers traced Willow's coat, feeling the warmth of her, the life in her. His touch was tentative at first, then grew more confident as he realized the mare wasn't going to shy away. "She can't see me?" the boy asked. "No," Howard confirmed. "She can't see anything at all, just like you." "But they were wrong," Howard continued. "She has learned to navigate the world in a new way. She uses her ears, her nose, her memory. She's learned to trust me to guide her when she needs help. And she's learned to be brave when she needs to find her own way." "Can she really work?" the boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "This winter, during the worst blizzard I've ever seen, she helped me save my entire herd of cattle," Howard said. "She couldn't see where she was going, but she trusted me, and she used every other sense she had. She was magnificent." Howard led the boy around Willow, letting him feel her legs, her back, her face with its clouded eyes. He explained how she'd learned to navigate obstacles, how she'd memorized the layout of the barn and corrals, how she'd developed new ways of understanding the world around her. "Does she know she's blind?" the boy asked suddenly. It was a profound question, one Howard had never really considered. "I think," he said slowly, "that she knows the world is different than it used to be. But I don't think she thinks of herself as broken or less than. She's just adapted to her new reality. She's learned that different doesn't mean worse, just different." The boy was crying, quiet tears slipping from beneath his bandages. His mother moved to comfort him, but he shook his head. "I thought my life was over," he said. "I thought I'd never be able to do anything again." "Your life isn't over," Howard said firmly. "It's different now, that's true. It'll be harder in many ways. But different doesn't mean worthless. Harder doesn't mean impossible. Willow taught me that." They stayed for 2 hours, the boy running his hands over every part of Willow, asking endless questions about how she'd learned, what she could do, whether she was happy. Howard answered everything with patience, understanding that these weren't really questions about a horse. They were questions about possibility, about hope, about whether a life without sight could still be a life worth living. As the Douglas family prepared to leave, the father shook Howard's hand, too emotional to speak. The mother simply said, "Thank you," but those 2 words carried the weight of the world. After they'd gone, Howard stood with Willow in the fading afternoon light. He thought about that day in October when he'd stood in a crowd watching a blind horse everyone had given up on. He thought about the decision he'd made, the $5 that seemed like madness, the months of patient work, the slow building of trust and capability. He thought about what Willow had given him in return. She hadn't just survived, she'd thrived. She hadn't just adapted, she'd excelled. She'd shown him that what the world called impossible was often just difficult, and that difficult was worth fighting for. She'd shown him that his own life, his isolated ranch, his solitary existence, his small sphere of influence, wasn't worthless just because it wasn't grand. He'd done something important here. He'd saved a life, and in doing so, he'd given hope to others who needed it. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Years passed. Howard continued his work on the mountain ranch, and Willow remained his closest companion. She learned new skills, adapted to new challenges, and became something of a legend in the region. People came from surprising distances to see the blind horse that could work, could navigate, could live a full and purposeful life, despite her disability. Howard never charged admission or asked for anything in return. He simply let people see what was possible, and left it to them to apply those lessons to their own lives. The boy who'd lost his sight came back several times, and Howard watched as his confidence grew. Eventually, his family moved on, but Howard heard years later that the boy had learned Braille, gone to school, and was teaching other blind children. The father wrote that Willow had given his son the first glimpse of hope after the accident, and that hope had been enough to build a life on. Howard was 63 years old when Willow finally grew old and ill. She'd lived nearly 20 years in his care, far longer than anyone had expected. He was with her at the end, holding her head in his lap, speaking the same calm words he'd spoken that first night so many years ago. "You're safe," he whispered. "You're home. You did everything right." She died peacefully, and Howard buried her on a hillside overlooking the ranch where she'd learned to live again. He marked her grave with a simple wooden cross and a plaque he'd had made in town. It read, "Willow, she taught us that worth isn't measured by sight but by courage." Howard Swift lived another 15 years after that and remained on his mountain ranch until the end. People said he was stubborn, that he should move to town where life would be easier, but he never did. He'd learned something from Willow that he carried for the rest of his life. Sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones everyone else overlooks. Sometimes the greatest achievements come not from natural talent or perfect circumstances, but from refusing to give up when giving up would be easier. And sometimes the measure of a life well lived isn't how much you accomplish for yourself, but how much hope you give to others who've forgotten how to hope. Howard Swift's ranch eventually passed to a distant cousin, then was sold, then subdivided. The buildings are gone now, reclaimed by the forest. But that grave on the hillside remains, maintained by hikers and locals who've heard the story and felt compelled to preserve it. The blind horse who worked again. The impossible mare who changed lives. The golden Palomino named Willow who proved that what the world calls broken can still be beautiful, useful, and profoundly valuable. If this story touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss our next story of courage, redemption, and the incredible bonds between humans and horses. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that setbacks don't define our worth. And let us know in the comments, what's the most valuable lesson you've learned from an animal? We read every single comment and love hearing your stories. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the most incredible journeys begin with seeing value where others see none.